Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome a new contributor to this episode. Her name is Hannah Schmid. She's a contributor for Young Voices, also a policy analyst for the Illinois Policy Institute. Hannah, welcome to the program. I'd love it if you'd take just a second and just kind of give us a little bit of your background, tell us who you are and what you do.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. Like mentioned, I'm a policy analyst at the Illinois Policy Institute. I mostly research educational freedom here in our great state of Illinois, and the intersection, which often happens with teachers' unions, the intersection between labor and education. So we're really just fighting for a freer Illinois and parents to have more options to find the best academic outcomes and opportunities for their students.
I'm looking at an article you wrote for realcleareducation.com, and it's clear that Illinois, among other states, is facing some problems with students struggling to meet the proficiency standards. And you mentioned a couple of other states that likewise have encountered this, and they took very different directions. So basically, Illinois is facing a choice. Kind of set the situation for us. When we're talking about reading proficiency standards, where do those standards stand as it is right now for Illinois students?
So unfortunately, right now, we're seeing across our entire nation an early literacy epidemic, and Illinois students are suffering the consequences along with students in most every other state. Illinois is one of 41 states in DC, in which just 1 in 3 or fewer of fourth grade students met reading standards, so reading proficiency standards in 2024 on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So like you mentioned, this is an issue facing not just Illinoisans, but students across our nation. This is especially concerning, just to set the scene of why we should care. Obviously, that sounds like a bad statistic, but beyond that point, the transition from 3rd to 4th grade is a very critical reading milestone for students, and research has found students who struggle to read at grade level at this critical milestone, up to half of the printed curriculum in 4th grade forward is nearly incomprehensible to these kids, and they become 4 times more likely to drop out of school. So this is a very critical time. We want to catch students and ensure that they're at grade level standards in this really core subject of reading. So like you mentioned, there have been states that have taken different approaches to this. We see states like Mississippi, which have invested in science of reading, evidence-based reforms to ensure students are back on track in these early years. But we also see states such as neighboring Wisconsin from Illinois, which has lowered standards in their state assessments to in a sense, just inflate the number of students that we're seeing publicly meeting these standards, but it's not really changing that on these national assessments.
So which way is Illinois leaning as far as addressing this crisis? Have they given an indicator of how they'd like to approach it?
Education leaders in Illinois have unfortunately fallen prey to what looks nice and fancy up in Wisconsin, just, artificially raising these proficiency rates by lowering state standards. So again, like we said, in Wisconsin, we saw that they lowered their bar for proficiency and saw a 12% drop in the number of students who are scoring at their lowest level of proficiency. But again, that was just artificially inflated. And Wisconsin is not alone in this. At least 4 other states have also lowered their proficiency bars for students and seen scores artificially increase as a result of that. So Illinois leaders have toyed with this and are talking about this in a report they released on their vision for our state. Trying to push Illinois to lower our state benchmarks. But again, it's unfortunate when Illinois, we saw in the most recent national exam that just a third of students are even meeting grade level standards. So dropping those standards is not going to improve these rates, but what can is proven reforms like what we saw in Mississippi, where lawmakers, again, back in 2013, invested in evidence-based reforms, which saw Mississippi go from 50th in the nation for 4th grade reading up to 17th in the nation. Wow. And they were just one of just 10 states in this last 2024 national assessment, which saw their scores in 4th grade increase, while most other states saw their scores decrease over the past 2 years.
As you're describing, the approach of, well, I guess we'll bring the standards down so we can bring those numbers up. This is reminding me of a friend who had a car that was prone to problems. And so when the check engine light would come on, he had a Band-Aid he would stick over the check engine light. There, problem solved. And, if the engine was making weird noises, he would just turn up the radio. And it kind of reminds me of that in the sense that it's really not doing anything to fix the problem, but at least it's distracting from it so it's not as obvious. Tell me about with Mississippi seeing the results that they're seeing, why aren't more states, why aren't all the states, for that matter, jumping on board this and taking a similar approach so that they actually address the problem rather than just mask it?
Definitely. So after Mississippi passed their legislation back in 2013, we've seen other states like Florida and Colorado also pass similar, very expansive evidence-based reading reforms for their early learners. And just since 2013, again, since Mississippi passed their reform, we've seen 40 states enact some sort of evidence-based method to teach students how to read. Now, not all of those have been comprehensive enough. So that's now where we're seeing that we should take lessons from Mississippi and invest in more comprehensive reforms. And that's something that we can do here in Illinois. Like you said, it's a Band-Aid right now if we just lower benchmarks, and this is not a Band-Aid that will last. It'll break off eventually because these are students, and like we mentioned, dropout rates increase. There's so many negative consequences to not handling the root of this issue and ensuring students are reading at these critical ages of third, fourth grade, and lower elementary.
Now, Hannah, you have some very specific suggestions that Illinois lawmakers and educators could take to see similar results to what Mississippi has seen. What are some of those steps?
Yeah, so there are really 5 steps which we've seen, and we gathered from research in Mississippi and other states which have enacted very comprehensive reforms, again, like I mentioned, such as Florida and Colorado. So some of those include ensuring school districts provide universal reading screenings to every lower elementary student to identify reading problems early. Just again, making sure that we know which students are struggling so that we can then go in and give them really targeted interventions, which is, again, another step that Illinois should pursue, which other states like Mississippi have done. Just finding which students are struggling and then giving them individualized reading interventions to make sure that they're meeting their grade level standards by the end of that school year, especially that third to fourth grade transition to mitigate those harms that we see happen for students who struggle to read. Some other reforms include engaging parents more in their child's reading deficiency, identification, and also the remediation of their child's struggles with reading. Again, parents, we see studies have shown that students do better when parents are more involved in their child's educations. This is a way to make sure parents are aware that their student is struggling in these early grades, and help engage them in whatever their child's specific intervention should be. And part of engaging parents also means collaborating with parents to determine where students should be placed at the end of a school year if they're still struggling to read. We've seen states like Mississippi enact legislation that requires students who are struggling to read at the end of third grade to be retained for another school year. But here in Illinois, we're advocating for that decision instead of a blanket decision because we recognize every student is different. Just engaging parents more in that decision when his child is reading at the end of the school year to empower parents to be decision makers alongside their teachers in schools to decide whether retaining their child is the best option or pushing them along to the next school year with better supports and interventions. And ultimately, too, Illinois just needs to get down to basics for reading instruction and require science of reading instruction methods that really hammer down the basics of phonics and vocabulary, and all those just simple building blocks to language, make sure students are equipped and teachers know how to best help their students in these evidence-based teaching practices.
And I don't know if this is a question that you're prepared to answer, but I'm curious, when such reforms as you're recommending are enacted, does it take some time? Is there some lag between when they start seeing better results, or is it something where they start to almost immediately see students improve?
There's definitely an implementation lag, like you mentioned, just as we get all school districts and teachers and administrators on board with this. And that's why it's so important to implement this on the state level. In Illinois, school districts could start right now by implementing these reforms within their own school districts. And they will see these, they will see these improvements among students, but enacting this statewide, there will be that delay that we might see in the outcomes, but ultimately it's an investment in these kids' futures, and one that's worth taking in Illinois.
Once again, we are talking with Hannah Schmid. She is a contributor for Young Voices as well as a policy analyst for the Illinois Policy Institute. Hannah, where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, they can find me at illinoispolicy.org under Hannah Schmid and find all my articles. So please, we welcome your readership, and we hope that you got on board with us to reform Illinois.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome another new contributor joining us for his first time today. I want to welcome Tristan Ringmo. Did I get your last name correct there, Tristan?
Yes, that's correct. Tristan Ringmo.
Great to make your acquaintance. If you would take just a moment, please, tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm a political commentator with Young Voices. I interned at the Adam Smith Institute and the Institute of Economic Affairs last year. And at the moment, I'm completing my undergrad at the London School of Economics.
Well, I'm looking at an article that you've written. The title is British Broadband is About to Get the Boost It Needs. And so bring me up to speed. I assume that Britain is probably quite far along technologically. I would assume that the broadband situation in your country is very advanced. Talk to me about where it stands and what this boost is that it's about to get.
Well, the British telecoms industry has been held in the hands of an oligopoly for a very long time. Between O2, Virgin Media, Three, and BT, it's been dominated by a certain few players over the past few decades. And the piece I wrote most recently tackles the Amazon, the company Amazon have recently launched an initiative called Project Kuiper. Now, Project Kuiper is a satellite broadband connection, which has recently been given approval by Ofcom, which is the regulatory body in the UK. And it sets a really interesting precedent and a very optimistic future for British broadband, that satellite initiatives, very similar to Starlink in the States, give a great amount of potential to the UK, where internet at the moment relies on fiber optic broadband, which relies on a lot of infrastructure investment, a lot of digging up the countryside. And this new approval for Amazon gives us a really fighting chance in terms of British broadband. And a lot of countries do have a kind of presumption that the UK is leading the way in this industry. But in fact, we are actually 46th for download speeds out of 56 developed countries. Now, the UK has one of the poorest internet speeds out of the developed world. And this really gives us a glimmer of hope in what seems to be a losing battle.
So I have to ask, I was under the impression, too, I would have ranked Britain much, much higher. Why is it that those download speeds are so low in Britain?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, a lot of people are under the presumption that Britain is leading the way in technology. However, this is actually false. I mean, we have a lot of rural communities in which simply the infrastructure has not been built. And this is a problem spanning back decades since the privatization of BT. The other companies which have stepped in to fill the void, they've actually been held back by a lot of the regulations, which are saying you can't dig up this area. Councils are not giving them permission to install the necessary infrastructure. And therefore, we are in need of a satellite network. I mean, I think it's the free market operating at its finest, whereby an innovative solution, which has come from North America through Starlink, and in this instance, particularly through Project Kuiper by Amazon, this gives us a glimmer of hope, where we previously relied on hundreds of millions of pounds of infrastructure investment, whereas now we can almost leapfrog this technology and get to a place where we are on par with other developed economies, such as the US and throughout Europe.
So what sparked this openness to competition?
So Ofcom recently gave permission to Amazon to launch this initiative, and this was relatively unheard of previously, where it had been, as I said, in the hands of an oligopoly who were presumed to be the leaders in terms of technology in this industry. But in fact, we're finding out that these free market solutions, which had not been considered previously, actually give a lot of power to new investors in the UK telecoms industry, whereas before they were previously unheard of or unthought of.
Nice. I have some experience with Starlink. I live in a very rural area myself, and I got my first Starlink receiver about 4 years ago, and it really is a game changer. So I would love to see something comparable available to well, everywhere that needs good broadband. What kind of regulatory hoops have to be jumped through in order for this Project Kuiper to really take off?
Yes, well, in the UK, the telecoms industry is regulated by a conglomerate called Ofcom. Now, they are the regulatory body of telecommunications in the UK, and they're responsible for deciding who may or may not engage in a certain infrastructure investment. Now, Amazon had previously not been considered for this role, and Starlink, although they have been launching across Europe, were believed to be the sole power in this industry. And we've relied relentlessly on fiber optic cables as a means for this issue to be resolved in rural communities. Now, this has been proven to be not the fact. It would require hundreds of billions of pounds to actually install the physical infrastructure which is necessary. But instead, we've actually had the power to jump across this, as I've said. By looking to satellite technologies, which are coming from these very innovative American firms.
I'm curious too if there will be no slowdowns because of concerns about satellite dishes. Will the Amazon system utilize the very small, unobtrusive dishes, kind of like Starlink utilizes?
Well, it's for the UK, it's a very new system, and the Project Kuiper is launched at 3 different grades, and it begins with the budget system, which begins at 100 megabits per second, and perhaps in the States this is seen as average, but in the UK we're averaging about 70 megabits per second.
Wow.
Of internet connection, which is very poor on an international scale. And the Economist article, which revealed we're 46th out of 56 countries, has shown that we are lagging behind our competitors, and especially in the age of Zoom meetings, in the age of the workplace largely being transformed online, the AI revolution, we are lagging behind, and this gives us a fighting chance versus other economies which are much ahead of us at the moment.
Tristan, what kind of opportunities does this open up for citizens who live in rural areas? If they wanted connectivity, did they have to migrate to more populated, more urban centers before?
Well, I would say so. I mean, in the UK, there is an extraordinary divide between the North and the South. And part of this is that those who are seeking careers opportunities are migrating largely to cities like London, where the opportunities are very commonplace. However, in the digital age, this does not need to be so. A lot of people can work remotely. A lot of people can work through the internet and preserve give a certain a similar quality of labor actually through online working opportunities, but this hasn't been offered to them because it's been held in the hands of a regulator and an oligopoly, which has meant that companies like Amazon, companies like Starlink are unable to provide the benefit which they are able to offer. And Britain has been held back relentlessly in the hands of the oligopoly and in the hands of regulation.
So you had mentioned there's a budget level that which people can start. I'm just wondering, cost-wise, what will customers be paying to have that ultra-fast broadband at any of those levels?
Well, at the moment, it's hard to say. The Amazon has not released the official pricing tiers for the technology, but at the moment, British taxpayers and British consumers are paying a lot more than their counterparts in Europe and a lot more than their counterparts in North America for subpar technology. Now, I think Amazon and companies like Starlink is yet to gain approval in the UK. But I think with these opportunities, they do have an option to provide such services at a much lower cost than a lot of their competitors, who, as I said, do need to engage with much higher infrastructure costs. And I do think that by leapfrogging in terms of technology, it is a very optimistic future for Britain.
I'm excited for you and excited for those who will be receiving that high-speed broadband. It is a real game changer, especially for those in rural areas. Again, we're talking with Tristan Ringmo. He is a commentator for Young Voices UK. Tristan, where can people follow your work and find you on social media?
Well, I'm relatively technophobic, so I'm not very present on social media networks like Twitter, but you can find me on LinkedIn. You can follow what I post up there. And yes, once again, Brian, thank you very much for having me on.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Aiden Grogan back to the program. Aiden, it's been a little while since we visited with you. For folks who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Aiden Grogan. I'm a history PhD student at Liberty University and the donor communications manager at the American Institute for Economic Research.
And you and I are going to be talking about tariffs today. I was telling you off the air, I just had a friend asking me about this earlier today. Hey, what's your take on tariffs? And I'm not too proud to admit, I really don't know much. The libertarian in me says, well, I believe it's a form of taxes and it will, raise the prices of things for the end consumer. But I can't say that I'm otherwise really well versed on this. So I'm anxious to get your take on things. I'm looking at your article from realclearmarkets.com. Tariffs won't bring on the golden age of America. So set the stage for us, Aiden. What exactly is being proposed by President Trump in terms of overhauling America's trading system through tariffs?
Yeah, well, various arguments are put forth in favor of protectionism. One is the national security argument, which I think has the most merit. Free traders, going all the way back to Adam Smith, understood that defense is of much more importance than opulence, as Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations. So that's always been understood as an exception to free trade. However, others say that we can revive American manufacturing through protectionism. Others say that protectionism is a good negotiation tactic, but that we're not actually going to levy the tariffs. Of course, the news today shows otherwise. Trump does intend to actually impose the tariffs. Many think that tariffs could also be a great source of revenue. I think the worst argument is that tariffs can be used to revive manufacturing and manufacturing employment. Trump imposed tariffs in 2018 on steel and aluminum, and the result of these tariffs was marginal increases in employment in the short term, but due to higher prices and retaliatory tariffs from China, there was actually a net loss of jobs. In fact, by middle of 2019, there were about 75,000 fewer jobs in manufacturing attributable to the steel and aluminum tariffs alone. So ultimately, tariffs do greater harm than good. They raise prices, and they don't revive employment in the way that many believe they can. They result in actually net losses in employment.
Aiden, I'm curious about historically the role that tariffs have played. And when I say historically, there was a time prior to 1913 when we did not have, the direct income tax. And so revenue was raised through other means besides directly taxing the income of American citizens. Did tariffs play a large role in how the government funded its operations prior to that time?
Yes, the federal government was financed through tariffs prior to the federal income tax amendment, but the federal budget at the time was significantly smaller than it is today. So eliminating the income tax and trying to generate significant revenue through tariffs is completely implausible. No serious economist thinks that that's actually going to work. And also, if you have extremely high tariffs in an effort to raise revenue, countries are simply going to stop importing, which doesn't raise the revenue that you're looking for. So it's sort of a lose-lose situation.
I was really hoping you would say, yes, if we would just get rid of the income tax, why, it would all be great. But that's clearly not the case. So what are we looking at as Trump is moving forward now into his second term? I know there is talk about tariffs. What is the reasoning behind the desire to implement these? Is it rooted in equalizing the playing field between other nations, that have tariffs against our goods, or is there something more at play?
His biggest reason for imposing tariffs this time around is as a negotiation tactic. And that can work when he threatens tariffs, such as against Canada, Mexico, or Colombia. Earlier on in his administration, he forced hasty concessions from those countries on immigration. But this time he's going the extra step, and he's using them not only as a negotiation tactic, but he's also trying to revive American manufacturing, or at least that's what he's saying publicly, because I think a lot of his base likes to hear that. But a lot of this gets very complicated. It has to do with the international financial system and the way that the dollar is overvalued around the world. Trump wants to sort of bring that down, and so he's trying to bring countries to the table, and tariffs is one way of trying to accomplish that. So it's sort of a means to an end.
What does it mean for American manufacturing? I'm specifically asking this because I'm under the impression we have outsourced or offshored a pretty good portion of our manufacturing. Does this incentivize more people producing more goods here at home?
So there's a major misconception about the American manufacturing base being gutted or hollowed out or outsourced. The biggest reason for the manufacturing employment decline in recent decades has been productivity gains through artificial intelligence, automation, information technology, and so forth. Several studies have found that 80 to 90% of the manufacturing job losses have been a consequence of technological change. So only a small amount have actually gone overseas. And therefore, tariffs are sort of counterproductive because they're going to result in higher prices, and this might cause many firms to simply hire more machines and lay off workers to make up for the higher prices that they face.
All right. So I know this is asking you to kind of make a judgment here, but can tariffs serve the purposes that Trump thinks that they're going to serve, or is he playing with fire? And is this likely, as was seen in his earlier administration, is this likely to come back and bite us in ways that might not be anticipated right now?
Certainly, it's going to come back and bite consumers through higher prices. We know that that's going to happen. Many of the protectionists think it's worth it, though, in pursuit of broader aims of national security, et cetera. I think Trump can definitely use tariffs as a form of negotiation, at least as far as the threat of tariffs. But if he goes ahead and imposes the tariffs, consumers are really going to feel it, and I think it's going to impact employment because the higher prices are gonna make firms make important decisions with regard to their labor force. That's what we saw in the first Trump administration, and we are likely to see that again. So the Trump administration should really learn from the tariff regime of the post 2017 American economic order and proceed in a healthier route that is more likely to safeguard our prosperity.
And help me understand this. You referenced this in your article that if tariffs are necessary, for instance, for national security, they really should come under the legislative branch of the government rather than executive. Can the president impose tariffs through executive orders, or is this purely supposed to be a legislative function?
According to the Constitution, it is supposed to be Congress that decides tariff policy. However, Congress doesn't really like to be held accountable, so they have gladly abdicated their responsibilities on trade policy to the executive branch. And we currently have a president who loves tariffs. He says tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, so he is happy to take on that responsibility himself.
Now, you actually offer some other ways that we could find our way to America's golden age. Tell me about some of the steps that could be taken, excluding tariffs.
Yeah, we need to take a much more long-term vision here, long-term approach, and understand that, well, all countries in the world are facing population decline, and that's going to result in a lack of productivity, economic stagnation. So to ensure that we remain prosperous and affluent, we need lower barriers to trade and investment. We need lower taxes, a less burdensome regulatory environment. Other countries that are smaller in population are definitely going to be dependent on imports from abroad. And I think that's the pathway towards sustained prosperity in the 21st century. We don't want to regress back into this neo-mercantilist system of high tariffs.
Once again, we are visiting with Aiden Grogan. He is a PhD history student at Liberty University, also a contributor with Young Voices and donor communications manager at the American Institute for Economic Research. Aiden, where can people follow you and your work?
You can follow me on X at Aiden Grogan, AIDANGROGAN. You can also find me at the American Institute for Economic Research. That's AIER.org.
And we are back. It's our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Ethan Watson back to the show. Ethan, you've been on here actually a number of times before, but for those meeting you for the first time, take a moment, tell us about who you are.
Absolutely. So my name's Ethan. I went to the University of Kansas for undergrad, got degrees in accounting and political science. Now I'm based out of the Kansas City area, and I'm a writer for Young Voices, just fighting the good fight and trying to be a voice for sort of Gen Z people interested in politics.
Yeah, I'm looking at this article you wrote for Detroit News. DOGE's youth is a feature, not a bug. And of course, we're talking about the Department of Government Efficiency, which we call DOGE. But I have to admit, I'm pretty blown away by some of the things that this young group of do I call them engineers, that they've been able to uncover in a remarkably short time. For those who aren't as familiar with what DOGE is, do you want to kind of set the stage for us as to what this entails?
Certainly. Yeah. So the DOGE is, as Elon calls it, his team of worker bees or Spartans. I've seen him call them on Twitter. But basically, it's a team of people going through our federal government and trying to find areas where there's waste, fraud, and abuse, DEI, ridiculous programs and expenditures that no one wants their money spent on, finding that and cutting it. And a big chunk of his team is a group of 19 to 25-year-old young men. These are not your average college frat guys. They are geniuses. One of them was using AI to decode an ancient Roman scroll. These are people that have worked at many tech startups with Elon and other sort of Silicon Valley types. So these are veritable prodigies as far as young people go. And I just think it's a beautiful thing that people this age are getting involved with the fixing of our government and trimming it down, because we are the people that have to live in this country for the next 60 years. And so we should take a stake and, hey, why are we being taxed so much? Where is our money going? Is it going to things that I want, or would it be better served being put towards a house or starting a family if that money was kept in my pocket? And I tend to think that the answer is, yeah, I think we should keep more of our money and use it for things that we believe in.
It's funny that some of the most vocal critics of this DOGE effort have been complaining about, well, these people are too young. They're inexperienced. They aren't professional bureaucrats like we are. And it's like, no, you don't get it. That's the point. They're not corrupted. And so they are able to find things that I think the professional bureaucrats would really rather keep hidden.
Retirement mine, which is literally a limestone mine where they're keeping the retirement forms for all the federal employees. I mean, that was, a beyond parody story. It felt like a Saturday Night Live skit that the limiting factor was how quickly they could run the elevator to move the retirement papers into the retirement mine. But you're exactly right. The problem is not that these people lack experience. It's that they lack experience in government. And that's why the left is really in a tizzy. They've never really had a problem with youth or inexperience before. I'm old enough to remember when they ran AOC for elected position, and she was a bartender and with zero prior experience. So I'm old enough to remember that. But you'll also notice that the attacks are not really coming on the work that DOGE is doing. They're not trying to defend the sex change surgeries in Guatemala or the transgender comic book in Peru. They're really just trying to attack Elon and his team, which is very telling in and of itself. But the reality is, when you have an intractable problem like the federal spending, like our ballooning national debt, sometimes you need a fresh set of eyes, a fresh perspective. That's what this administration's been all about. And that's how Elon runs all of his companies. And frankly, if a federal bureaucrat can't explain to a genius level IQ 25-year-old why a program needs to exist, then frankly, it's too complicated and it's against the principle of government transparency, and we need to restructure or cut it.
Now, I don't want to sound like I'm stereotyping when I say this, because I'm not going to suggest that Gen Z is monolithic and everybody thinks exactly the same. But I got to tell you, I am impressed with how Gen Z appears to be taking freedom more seriously than generations that came before them. I mean, not only their freedom, but they are more religious than other generations that came before them. And frankly, that gives me a lot of hope that there might actually be a return to common sense if Gen Z is doing some of the heavy lifting here.
Certainly. And I think, Gen Z and my generation, we came of political awareness during, the 2016 Trump era and then through the DEI. And it was so oppressive and so monolithic. And every time, you turn on the TV, because young men my age in particular, we're not super politically involved as a general rule, but it's you turn on the NFL and it's there. You turn on your favorite World War II video game and you have women of color fighting for the German team. It's like, well, hang on a second. Something is not adding up here. It just felt so ridiculous and at the same time so oppressive that I think my generation just used that natural youth rebellious spirit to push back on it. And it reached a fever point during COVID. And that's my reason why I got into politics. It's because I saw, some of these great years of my life being taken away with these arbitrary policies and rules. And if I dared to ask the question, I was told to sit down and shut up. And so I think at a certain point, it just hit a boiling point. And now my generation, which are utility maximizers, right? We want to find the way to get the most juice for our squeeze, so to speak. We want to maximize our utility, and we're finally applying that to our government. And I think it is a beautiful thing, Brian.
Yeah, I would agree, and I say that as an old Gen Xer. I'm right there. I was one of the first Gen X babies, but I've sometimes despaired over what seemed to be the apathy and the disconnect, and sometimes the just full on embrace of what seemed like hard left politics. And I love the fact that Gen Z seems to have their heads on straight, and I love that they don't appear to be easily intimidated either. These are people who seem to be made of substance.
Right. And, we were told back in 2012, 2016, I say we, I was 10 years old in 2012, but the American population was told in that time that we were at the end of history, that Obama's presidency was the end of politics as we know it, and the Republicans would never win an election again. I mean, I've even heard of them passing around electoral maps for Iowa and Texas go blue, like they were touting this. But their mistake has always been that demographics are destiny. In that case, they were thinking immigration meant that they would always win the elections, but they also assumed that they would always have the young vote, and young men break for Trump, especially by a wide margin. And so this is an excellent lesson that demographics are not destiny. In fact, you can reach any group of people, no matter how far they seem from your side right now, with good arguments and by addressing the issues that they care about, which is, hey, let's try to give you the America that you heard about from your grandparents and your parents. I feel you feel like you can't start a family, you can't put a down payment on a house. So let's try and solve that a little bit, or at least acknowledge that you're suffering and you're not quote unquote privileged. That's the message that really resonated. And I think the DOGE team is phenomenal marketing in that respect, because what they're doing is they're trimming around the edges. They're not going to save the national debt by cutting $1 billion here or even $1 trillion there, right? I mean, the debt is massive. But what they're doing is they're putting a little bit of blood in the water, and people are getting excited about cutting government again. They're seeing all these ridiculous illustrative examples, and it's whetting their appetite for a little bit more libertarian policies. We're not cutting Medicare or restructuring Social Security tomorrow, but maybe people are a little bit more willing to make that step now that they've gotten a taste for what it feels like to shrink the government, and they're getting a peek under the kimono, so to speak, to see all the craziness that's been happening. And so I think it's a beautiful thing and just a work of political genius.
I can say this, from my vantage point, what DOGE has been able to reveal has been shocking. Not that I didn't believe that there was some corruption and some hanky stuff going on, but the fact that it has been going on for so many generations, and so many generations of workers within that DC blob have either just chosen to roll their sleeves up and take part in it, or look the other way because it benefited them somehow.
Definitely. They've been neck deep in the Beltway mire, as I say, and these things have always been that way, and they figured it would always be that way. But this administration is all about shaking up the status quo. That's why when Trump came down that elevator in 2015, that's what he was about, and that's what he's been about ever since then. And I think the youth of the DOGE team is just one more aspect of how they're shaking up that status quo.
Now, let me share one quick concern that I do have for the people of this generation, of Generation Z, and that is I see some pretty, what I consider scary attempts to try to steer the U.S. and other nations into a global military conflict. And that's the generation it would fall on the hardest if that were to happen. And I would like to see DOGE and those of that generation, I'd like to see them protected from that. I don't want to see their lives squandered.
Brian. I mean, one of the biggest wastes of our money or abuses of our money has been funneling it to wars in the Middle East and funneling it to wars in Ukraine. We could spend a whole nother segment talking about that, but absolutely, the era of other countries being entitled to the fruits of American labor and our tax dollars, I think that's coming to an end, and that's a good thing. If your country can't stand on its own 2 feet, then I'm not so sure what a sovereign country you are.
Again, we're talking with Ethan Watson, a Young Voices contributor. Where can people find you on social media, Ethan?
Brian, you guys can find me on X at ERWatson13.
Thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate it.